responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So today, Chet Education Service is launching their Theme 7 report entitled Post-Disaster Schooling, a study of how countries manage their education system during a disaster and the steps they took to reestablish normality. So, but first, let me introduce myself. My name is Lesedi Matlala, and I'm based at Chet Education Service. I'm working as an M&E researcher under the M&E unit. So today we are joined by our guest, Dr. Deva Govender. I will just introduce him broadly before he comes in. So Dr. Deva Govender has broad experience in the educational sector. This amongst involves being a mathematics and physical science teacher and HOD for 22 years, a deputy principal for a period of 1 year, chief education specialist for a period of 4 years. Dr. Govender was also a project manager for 8 years and director of DPE for 1 year and chief director in LPDOE. So Dr. Govender is going to talk to us about the launching of the report entitled Post-Disaster Schooling, a study of how countries manage their education system during a disaster and steps they took to reestablish normality. So now this is a very interesting subject, given the fact that the coronavirus pandemic has changed our entire world. And for this reason, it is important for us to find our way back to normality. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Deva Govender. Doctor, welcome to the live stream.
Thank you, Lesedi.
Okay, so without maybe wasting time further, let me just go straight to our questions to start our conversation. So please just tell us about your involvement and your role in the research bootcamp that was held by Chet Education Service.
Thank you for this opportunity, Lesedi. And, you know, I had this wonderful opportunity and privilege of working with a diverse group of researchers. And within that group, we had 4 lead researchers, Mr. Duncan Hindle, Dr. Manewik, Dr. Daisy Reddy, and Mr. Godfrey Nkondo. And they led a team of young researchers. And these young trainee researchers are from JET Education Services and from the NECT. So it was a wonderful opportunity to work with this group of researchers. And we had a group of over 60s and a group of under 30s. So it was a wonderful mix. And of course, we had 3 peer reviewers. Mr. Godwin Koza, Professor Yusuf Said from Sussex University, and Dr. Amina Osman, who came from JET. The study was initiated by Godwin Koza, who quickly saw the gap in the education response soon after the declaration of the disaster by the president. So that's how I'd like to share my experience and involvement in the JET Research Bootcamp.
Thank you very much, Doc, for sharing us your experiences in the research bootcamp. So having read the report, the theme sounds very interesting. Could you please tell us what was the main objective of this particular theme?
So I think we would all agree that this COVID-19 pandemic caught all countries globally unprepared, both from the health perspective and from the education and economic perspectives. So the need for a solution whenever one is confronted by a challenge is to look at how we reacted and responded in the past. Unfortunately for us in South Africa, we cannot fall back on our own experience. Therefore, there was a need to look at the experiences of other countries, to learn from them on how they coped in education recovery, and also how to deliver education during a pandemic. So the main objective of this study was to summarize the literature on disasters and to draw on lessons and insights so that South Africa can use some evidence to guide and inform decision-making, policy-making, and planning whilst we are in the pandemic. In order to take our schooling system forward. So essentially, the objective of the research is to extract relevant and useful lessons that is meaningful within the South African context, so that it'll guide us in within the education sector.
Thank you very much for giving us a brief background about the research theme, Dr. Govender, and telling us about how you managed to draw some best practices from other countries of how to continue with education during this pandemic crisis. So, but an interesting thought has come to my mind of saying, did South Africa have a disaster recovery plan for education before COVID-19?
Well, Lesedi, unfortunately, like the other countries, South Africa was not prepared and did not have a disaster recovery plan. And the country as a whole, well, started with the health response, and of course, with it goes a plan in education. So it forced education experts and teacher unions and educators to fall back on the data coming from the medical experts so that they in turn could start thinking about and developing a disaster recovery plan. So it's all new. We are learning as we are going, and we are learning and getting better by the day. But the important thing is there has to be evidence-based planning and decision-making. And the evidence that we gathered from the research study is in part helpful in plotting the way forward.
Okay, thank you. From our beginning of our conversation, you have mentioned people that you have worked with in this particular project or theme. So tell us a bit about your research theme and the approach that all of you followed in this report.
So Lesedi, you know, the theme is the study involves desk work actually, and it requires one to fall back on the experiences of disasters in other countries. So in the research study, our delineation of the study was in terms of 4 categories. We looked at 4 kinds of disasters in different parts of the world. The first one is the category of a natural disaster. And the literature we looked at was the response of Indonesia to Indonesia and Haiti to the tsunami event. The second category, or the second type of disaster we studied, was conflict situations. And in particular, we looked at how the conflict in Rwanda and the conflict of community protests in Vuwani in Limpopo was managed both politically and educationally. The third category involved a study of the way in which Liberia coped with education and the health pandemic, namely the Ebola virus. And the fourth category was here in South Africa. We were looking at the response of South Africa, not only the government sector, but also the non-government sector, their response to managing education during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's the approach. And out of that, we summarized key lessons and insights, and there are about 13 of them that are very, very important to note from those experiences. And out of those 13, 5 lessons are common across all 4 case studies. So that's the approach in a nutshell.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing the research approach that was utilized to carry out this study. So what are the core findings that the case studies revealed about post-disaster schooling that could and possibly should be implemented in SA, considering COVID-19 and its impact in South Africa?
Okay, so as we distilled 5 common threads across those 4 case studies. And those are actually very, very important and critical lessons for us to take note of in moving out of the lockdown, planning to exit the lockdown, and to reopen the schooling system. So the first one of the 5, Lesedi, is about system, policy, procedures, and processes that are used to assess risks and to gather evidence. That's the first lesson, that the system has to have a strong policies and procedures to guide the districts and the schools in the country. So in particular, it would mean we should have a common framework and guideline with standard procedures for use at school level. For example, when learners return, what are the key requirements for safety? Social distancing, the use of masks, hand washing facilities, and so on. Then the second system aspect that that the research shows us as being important, and that's about setting up a data collection or intelligence gathering system that not only helps to monitor the readiness of schools and the compliance requirements, but also to gather data on the perceptions, fears, and concerns of teachers, parents, learners and youth, as well as school managers. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is that countries that go through disasters have to prepare themselves to ensure continuity of education. So in our instance, soon after the lockdown, schools were closed and children remained at home. This actually put pressure on parents, not only to care for the children, but also to look after the education of the children. So the lesson that comes out of that is that parents need support, advice on how to structure the school day at home, how to support the children to undertake their studies at home, possibly using the textbooks in the remote areas where there is little or no connectivity and access to the gadgets for learning. And also, for continuity, there has to be a transmission of the programs, either through radio or TV or suitable websites. So that's the second very valuable lesson, that we have to prepare ourselves in the future. And now we should continue, even as schools reopen, with homeschooling. In other words, the role of the parent becomes greater. And it's now a much more shared responsibility. The home and the school taking responsibility for learning. The third lesson is social mobilization. It comes from all 4 case studies. The involvement of stakeholders, parents, and community structures in, firstly, the protection and ownership of schools is critical. It's unfortunate that in South Africa, during this lockdown period, 1,577 schools were damaged, either because they were torched or because of theft of computers and printers and so on. And that's about 6.8% of the schools, which means the country has to now reprioritize its budget and find ways of rebuilding those schools. And of course, social mobilization is also another way to help with destigmatization. We haven't seen a lot in the media, but there is a possibility of stigmatization. So social cohesion, destigmatization, and the retention of learners in the schooling system is important, and that can be done through social mobilization. What the research is showing us, that during a pandemic, and even soon after the pandemic, learners are either displaced or they drop off from schooling. So we need to find ways of retention by involving the broader community. The fourth lesson that we pick up from the review of the literature is the importance of psychosocial support. We know that as the infection rate rises and the resulting deaths out of those infections is going to lead to trauma, fear, anxiety, and emotional stress, either by directly affected people or as members of the community. Now this, especially for teachers and learners, would require psychosocial support sites. And the lesson that we need to draw is that we need to look at how best we could strengthen the existing structures. So in terms of policy, schools are required to establish what we call school-based support teams that respond to learners in need of psychosocial support. And if they fail to resolve the problem, then it's referred to the next level, and that is at the district level. And in terms of policy, we have district-based support teams. So it's about revitalizing those, strengthening those structures. And beyond that, community structures have an important role to play. Churches and the NGOs can offer psychosocial support either through help desks or one-on-one face-to-face support. Of course, respecting the distance of 1.5 to 2 meters. And the last one, Lesedi, the last lesson that I'd like to highlight, and that's the fifth one. And this lesson comes especially from the experience in Liberia, where we saw the Ebola virus affecting education. And the approach that was used in the country where Ebola surfaced was to use a phased approach to exit the lockdown and to restart schooling. And clearly, if you watched the announcement that the minister and the deputy minister and the DG made last night, they are looking at a phased approach to reopening schools with the grade 7 and 12 students starting school on 1 June, and then progressively taking the other cohort into the schooling system. So that approach helps in two ways. The first way is that it allows for us to test 4 antidotes, which are social distancing, the use of masks, hand washing, and sanitizing. And the second advantage of using a phased approach, it allows for assessment of the spread of infection. So the fear is always there. If you open schools, will that create more infections and therefore overwhelm the health institutions? So the phased approach will also require the continuation of homeschooling. It does not mean that once learners go back to schools, we should de-emphasize homeschooling. It's a very valuable lesson that the country has learned about the role of the parent and the carer in supplementing the teaching and learning that happens in the classroom. So Lesedi, if I had to summarize the 5 very important lessons, the first one is about the system, strengthening or establishing systems and policies and procedures to guide the responses at school level. The second one is to find ways of continuing education during the pandemic. The third one is social mobilization. The fourth one is to set up and activate the psychosocial support services within communities and within the Department of Education, as well as the Department of Health. And of course, the last one is the phased approach to restarting education. Thank you.
These are very, very critical and important lessons. So starting from these lessons, these 5 lessons that you just shared with us, Doc, what are the strategies that we can bring to the attention of policymakers, especially towards our policy formulation for the resumption of schooling and restarting of education system after COVID-19? Just briefly to contextualize the strategies that this research can offer to policymakers.
Well, the first point is about providing some uniformity in the way in which we respond to the pandemic, and that would require policy guidelines, and within which we should have standard operating procedures. So if you recall, last night the minister mentioned the need for this guideline, which will be put on the DBE website soon, I'm sure within the week. The second one, in terms of national guidelines, will be about how best parents at home could support their children when it comes to education. And the importance of partnerships in dealing with education at home really is something that brings together the radio stations, the TV stations, as well as organizations that have digital resources. So I think the creation of a catalog of these programs helps parents and the public in general to appreciate what's available and to make use of the programs at the specific times when they are transmitted. So in terms of policy, one could also look at policy on psychosocial support. This would probably require a national model that can be rolled out to strengthen the existing policy on psychosocial support that makes it very clear how community structures can work with government structures. So I think in terms of policy and guidelines, those are the important issues that we should look at.
This then brings us to the end of our conversation. Thank you very much, Dr. Govender, for joining us today and sharing these valuable insights, especially in times of this COVID-19 crisis. And thank you very much to the viewers who managed to tune in. We are live on YouTube. For those who tune in late, the video, you can find it there on YouTube under Chat Education Services website. So before I finally close this conversation, any last final words that you like to share with the viewers before I finally close it, Dr. Govender?
Well, thank you much for this opportunity again. I think the important thing is to learn and build back better, so that when next we confront a pandemic, whether it's an earthquake or conflict or a natural disaster or some health pandemic, we are better prepared, not only as an education system, but as a country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Govender. Thank you.